With the Jays rapidly falling down the standings again, as everyone expected would happen, there's been a serious push from fans, and some reporters, to immediately call up mega prospect Vlad Guerrero Jr., who has been a home run hitting machine in Double-A. Granted, there's salary considerations and other contractual weirdness due to baseball's unions, but there doesn't appear to be much of a downside at this point for either side. Keith, Vince McMahon's $1 Million Mania. WWE has their own version of Double-A, or Triple-A, I guess, in the form of NXT. Of course, comparing wrestling to baseball is not a perfect analogy, since so much is based on the intangibles of getting over rather than sheer stats and athleticism. In fact, it's probably more accurate to use the analogy of Dancin' Homer from the second season of The Simpsons. Some stuff just plays better in the sticks, ya know. Here's 4 of the most disappointing cases where the top people headlining Full Sail University just couldn't make it work once they got to the main roster. Adam Rose. Pretty much the beginning and ending of all discussions about acts who got Dancin' Homered once they made it to the big time. Ray Lepin had spent years working in NXT and floundering in the mid-card as South African big game hunter Leo Kruger, a role that was tweaked more than once since debuting in 2012 and yet still wasn't any closer to getting him onto the main roster. Sometimes it was a vague Tarzan ripoff, sometimes it was closer to Kraven the Hunter from the Spider-Man comics, but either way it was going nowhere for him. Finally, he came up with a new gimmick to repackage himself once and for all: decadent rock star Adam Rose. An extremely thinly veiled take on the All the Snow character played by Russell Brand in the movie Get Him to the Greek. Adam Rose was a stereotypical rock god who had an implied drug problem and a harem of weirdos called the Rosebuds, who followed him around from party to party. Did I mention his insanely catchy theme song, written by WWE's WizKid production team CFO $, because it was pretty great. Rose and his people would come out singing along to the song, win a quick match, and then he'd stage dive off the apron and get carried back to the dressing room while everyone partied. Finally, he had found the ticket to the big leagues. He debuted on Raw soon after, and everyone was like, what the hell is this? Turns out that what plays well in front of 300 college students in an intimate setting completely loses everything once you expand it to a 15,000-seat arena filled with a completely different crowd. The main roster audience just didn't understand the joke, or maybe Vince McMahon didn't, or maybe both, but the gimmick was dead in the water from day one. Granted, the ceiling on his potential wasn't exactly WWE World Champion, but within record time he was banished to the pre-show purgatory of Main Event, and feuding with his own giant bunny. Even worse, turns out that Rose's implied drug problems were closer to the truth than he had admitted, and he was released for violation of the wellness policy and domestic abuse issues in 2016. On the bright side, one of the guys from his Rosebuds in NXT was brought up separately and repackaged into Braun Strowman, and he's doing pretty well for himself, I hear. Keith, speaking of Braun Strowman, the Ascension. At the same time that Adam Rose, Leo Kruger was debuting in NXT in 2012, a tag team known as the Ascension was also being formed. Comprised of Kenneth Cameron and Connor O'Brien, they were a high-concept gimmick with influences of the Matrix and a vague allusion to the Illuminati and other such conspiracy theories. As a team, they were nothing special, but it was a neat idea for a gimmick and something really different. Then, in 2013, Cameron was arrested for a DUI and let go from NXT, eventually resurfacing in TNA as Bram, leaving the team in limbo before job guy Rick Victor was enlisted as a replacement. From there, the team was given a drastic makeover, overhauling their look to a more blatant, black leather and spikes, riff on the Road Warriors and adding generic heavy metal entrance music and growling interviews. Surprisingly, they seemed to gel better as a team, and were given a massive push in NXT, winning the tag team titles from the team of Corey Graves. Then, when they inevitably lost the titles and were called up to the main roster, it all fell apart. They were immediately restyled from a riff on the Road Warriors into just straight up trying to look like the Road Warriors, complete with face paint and similar haircuts. And it turned out that having an undefeated streak in NXT meant nothing in WWE, because they were quickly beaten by a variety of mid-card teams on the main roster and soon were reduced to an opening act comedy duo, that is. When they were booked on shows at all, it's all rather mystifying, because normally they are exactly the kind of team that McMahon loves to push, a pair of muscular guys who cut menacing promos and look like human action figures. Eventually they became the punchline in the Fashion Police sketches and currently reside as one of the forgotten off-screen draftees in the last Superstar shakeup, patrolling the network-exclusive D shows and barely winning more than guys like Zack Ryder. Apparently just calling yourself the Ascension isn't enough to actually rise up the card. Keith, the new Ascension? Well, no, but Hideo Itami now. To be totally fair here, even his NXT run was something of a disappointment due to injuries and such. But, let's put this into perspective, because Kenta Kobayashi, or, as he was better known in Japan, Kenta, was a huge star internationally. Like a top draw for many years in pro wrestling, Noah, and one of the best wrestlers in the world, so it's not an exaggeration to say that when he was signed by WWE in 2014, people expected him to destroy the competition in NXT and then go to the main roster and become an immediate star like his contemporary Shinsuke Nakamura eventually did. After a lavish contract signing and unveiling of his new name on an NXT TakeOver special, Itami immediately started having trouble adjusting to the North American style after years of working in Japan. His matches were, you know, good, but people kept waiting for the breakout moment where he busted out his original version of the go-to sleep and really blew everyone's mind with a star-making performance. In particular, fans were disappointed when he was featured in an in-depth documentary feature about competing in the Andre the Giant Memorial Battle Royal at WrestleMania and seemed to be building towards winning the match for his main roster debut, only to be thrown out by Big Show in a meaningless elimination that was completely glossed over. Then the injuries came, as he suffered multiple problems with his shoulder and knees, setting up a storyline with Kevin Owens as the cause of the injuries that was completely dropped when Owens was promoted to the main roster ahead of him. Itami spent more time on the sidelines than actually wrestling, but once he turned heel in 2017 he seemed to finally find his groove as a top guy, and headlined a takeover against Bobby Roode that proved to be the high point of his NXT career. And then he got injured again and disappeared for another few months. Finally, in 2018, he was promoted to the main roster with a whimper rather than a bang, getting relegated to the lowly 205 Live division and quickly getting bounced from the Cruiserweight title tournament early in the year. He seems to be a downward trajectory again and has all but disappeared from TV, basically now a guy who opens house shows for indifferent crowds. I mean, I suppose it was worth the gamble on his part to try to make it on the big stage of WWE, but ouch, Apollo Crews, whereas some of the guys above had clear issues that were going to hamstring them regardless of circumstances, Apollo is clearly just a case of someone getting called up way too early, with no plan for him once he got there. Simon UHAA, the former UHAA nation on the indie scene, was everything that WWE looks for in a prospect: interesting backstory, multi-sport amateur career, culturally diverse, good-looking, and a combination of a high flyer and an impressive power wrestler. He debuted in NXT as Apollo Crews, clearly going for a combination of Apollo Creed Terry Crews, in August 2015, and immediately starting squashing lower-level guys in short order. He got over huge with the crowd, and seemed to be on a trajectory for a title shot at the NXT Championship after some seasoning. But then the seasoning never came. His promos, which were still weak, never got the chance to develop, given that it's, developmental, and he was rushed up to the main roster the night after WrestleMania in 2016. Perhaps those in charge saw the look of the body and standing moonsaults and never stopped to ask any questions, but the result was an immediate disaster. Cruz was pushed initially for a few weeks but then started doing jobs for guys like Dolph Ziggler in the mid-card, and then got bounced between Raw and SmackDown in drafts with no direction evident. Despite a smiling persona and natural babyface charisma, he was inexplicably turned heel and joined up with Titus Worldwide as a meaningless addition to the team, seemingly to give the tag team division another team to lose in multi-man matches on Raw. Early in 2018 he even lost his last name, merely going by Apollo, for a while before that got forgotten and he was suddenly Apollo Crews, again with no explanation forthcoming for either change. Had he stayed on NXT for another year, he likely would have built up a following and expanded his promos and in-ring work enough to become a star, but as it stands, it doesn't seem likely he's going to break out anytime soon.